Hi, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really, I can't say, I don't know if I should say looking forward to talking to you because I'm kind of pretty upset about this issue, but I'm interested to learn more.
Well, we're all figuring it out as we go, so we can see what we know, but there's still a lot of questions about everything that's going on. So
yeah, so of course, I guess about a week ago, Justin Trudeau started threatening to strand Canadians abroad, which didn't really surprise me, but he did follow through on Friday, I believe, introducing not only the mandatory PCR testing at the airport for people returning to Canada, and that's, of course, on top of the pre-boarding test that's already required of travelers. But the kicker is, of course, that Canadians who are returning to Canada are now being forced, or I think it's beginning on February 15th. Is that correct? They're being forced to stay in a government-approved hotel for at least 3 days while they're waiting for their test results at their own expense, maybe 2 weeks if they get a positive COVID test, which Trudeau has informed us will cost at least $2,000 per person. Is that right that this is starting on the 15th of February? Do you know?
Well,
actually, that date right?
In the coming weeks. I mean, I haven't seen the order yet that they're operating under, because it seems to me that some of this at least goes above and beyond what the Quarantine Act provides. So I'm assuming that there is going to be an order in council about it, but I don't know. They said further information will be coming in the weeks ahead. So there've been a couple of press releases on the website, but I haven't seen any other orders, that would elaborate on what it is they're doing and under what authority. Like the Emergencies Act has never been declared federally, which is the legislation that replaced the War Measures Act. So they are, I assume, operating under the Quarantine Act, but it has its limits too. And some of the things that have been announced and that have already happened, as far as we know, don't seem to fit necessarily within the confines of that act. So even though they've said, well, these things are going to happen in the coming weeks, we've had at least 3 stories come to our attention out of Calgary, where people have been detained already and taken into hotels or some location that the federal government has set aside for this without telling people where they're going. Have you heard some of those stories yet? Because I can elaborate a little bit on what we've been told.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because I read the press release on the Justice Center's website, that and the letter that you guys sent on the 29th to the government. And I did see that you said that people had been already, was it that people were being arrested or that they're being detained? What's happening there?
Well, we're trying to figure it out. And so we still are early days and we still need more information, but what we're being told anecdotally and from talking, we made contact with one family where the wife was traveling on business and she got didn't get a PCR test, rather she got an antigen test, the rapid test, and when she was in the States. So she had her negative test results, which enabled her to get on her flight to come back to Canada. But so I haven't flown since they've incorporated some of these things in terms of I've flown within Canada, but I haven't left the country. So I haven't seen the paperwork or documentation or app or whatever that you have to fill in now. But presumably she submitted the information about her test that she had done. And it was determined by people presumably monitoring the passengers' data that she didn't have the right kind of test. She was supposed to have had a PCR test. So when she arrived in Calgary, they detained her. She was met at the airport by representatives. They thought it was Alberta Health, but this is actually federal. This is public health federally that I believe met her at the airport. as did Calgary Police, who've issued a statement indicating that they were just basically doing what they were supposed to do, which was accompany passengers. She was put into a white van. This is what was reported by her husband, that was kind of tarped off inside to keep the driver and the other person in the vehicle safe, I guess, from this woman who had a negative test. And they took her to what apparently was a hotel but they wouldn't tell her where it was. And she was allowed to have her phone, so I'm sure she could have figured it out, but they wouldn't tell her husband. They wouldn't give any information as to her whereabouts. And in another instance that we've heard about, and this isn't confirmed, the evidence hasn't been tested, but what we were told was the fellow was released in a different case and told not to disclose where he had been held, or he would face a penalty. So, and now a third one I just saw before I started talking to you tonight was a woman who went to meet her son at the airport in Calgary. All of these were happening in Calgary. And he also had the wrong kind of test and had been detained. And so she had to leave without her son. She didn't indicate how old he was, but she wasn't terribly old looking herself. So presumably not, if not a child, certainly a younger adult. And, so that's 3 instances. Before they even roll this out, we already have people being snatched up at the airport and whisked off to undisclosed locations to be held until they can produce a negative PCR test. So that's where we're at.
So, I mean, it doesn't sound to me as though Trudeau has really thought this through. Like, there doesn't really seem to be a plan yet for what's going to happen to people when they show up at the airport in Canada. I don't know what these hotels are that they're being taken to. I'm assuming this is only related to air travel and not people who are crossing the border by land or water, I suppose.
Oh, actually, they said that in the next few weeks they're going to start imposing it on land borders, on the land crossings as well. So everybody will have to have a negative PCR test that they get at the border. So it sounds like, and again, I'm still trying to get to the bottom of this, so this could change, but from what we've seen so far, it isn't adequate that you just produce the test results that you got when you boarded. That won't be enough. You will have to have a test done at the border and immediately go into your 3-day holding cell at a hotel while you wait for the results to come back. Now, it might be less than 3 days, but they're saying a maximum of 3 days you'll be held at your own expense at a hotel, which they say they're going to disclose. At the moment, they're not telling people, but according to what I've read, they're going to release the details of these hotels. But it sounds like it's not optional. Like, you come across the border as a Canadian citizen and you are immediately going into detention, even if you have already.
Really, I mean, I don't know that you probably don't have the answer to this question. I'm just I don't know how they would do that in terms of land borders. Like, I don't know how they would connect with every Canadian coming across the border by land and bring them to this.
I don't know. There's going to be exemptions too. And so we haven't seen all that yet. I mean, there have to be exemptions, right? I mean, we have a massive land border and we have essential people coming across the border all the time. So what's that going to entail? We haven't seen yet who the exemptions are going to apply to. I mean, they're not going to be doing that with truckers coming across with supplies. And we need those supplies. I mean, we can't shut down our border completely. And we haven't been for the last 10 months. So we've had tons of people pouring in. I don't remember the numbers offhand, but, we're in the, tons of people. It's a very busy border still with transport trucks coming back and forth. So they're not going to put all those people into quarantine. They can't. So I don't know yet what the exemptions will entail, but there are all sorts of reasons why people travel that isn't frivolous. And, if you're a student abroad or maybe you're going across for medical treatments, some people have to do that because they can't get treatments that they need in Canada, or, that maybe they have loved ones that they need to see, right? And it's not, or look after or whatever. So there's even cross-border custody situations and all kinds of wrinkles to this that are going to make life very, very difficult for a lot of people, and not just travelers. Although, thank goodness all of our politicians were able to get their holidays in over Christmas because, now Now they won't be able to travel either, I presume.
Right. So is this legal?
Megan, I wish I could say that definitively, that it's not. We think it's unconstitutional, but our Constitution has really taken a beating over the last 10 months. It really has. These restrictions and emergency measures are all supposed to be subject to the Charter. But you know what? I'm fairly convinced that most of our leaders have not paid very much attention to the Charter. And the longer this goes on and the less they're held to account, the longer they can get away with things, the harder it is to rein them in. I mean, it gets ridiculous. At some point, we're all, this is controversial, but I kind of feel like what we're all suffering is the projection of these politicians who have made disastrous decisions along the way, and federally not getting the vaccines secured as quickly, and and ensuring that was all going to be put in place, and provincially protecting our long-term care homes, which is where the vast majority of these deaths are occurring. So, instead of focusing their efforts on the things that are their job to control, they're kind of almost deflecting onto the rest of us. The reality is that the number of cases that you can actually tie to travel is around 2%. And that's on the government's own data. We had pulled that when we were looking at it, but I think something like, I'll tell you exactly, 1% related to travelers themselves, and 1.5% from contact with. Maybe I have that backwards. Hang on one sec. Okay. Contact with a traveler, 1% of known exposures, and from traveling outside Canada, 1.4%. So this is small potatoes. This isn't really where the biggest transmissions are occurring. But, again, it's public pressure, right? You've got all these people who are, just like in the spring, are making demands that everything be shut down and close the border, and all these new variants that everybody's all worked up about before we even know whether they're actually going to be any more deadly or virulent than what we've seen before. So far, we're taking these draconian steps. So, but I don't. To answer your question, are they legal? Well, we're going to have to find that out in the court of law. But so far, the courts haven't really had occasion to weigh in on all this stuff. I think when we're talking about whisking Canadians off to undisclosed locations, that's definitely not in compliance with the Charter, and in ways that I can't imagine a judge would think was acceptable. But like I said, those could be just early aberrations, and in the next few weeks, they will probably fix things so that they are not so blatantly in violation. And likely those kinds of things that they're doing are going to sort of become accepted as the new norm, unless we can get into court and get a judge to rule that they're, that it's not justified on the grounds that this is not the big one. This is not a disease like Ebola or smallpox or anything like that. It's largely still confined to the elderly and the very, very frail. And we get so little information, so little granular detail that helps us assess this properly, that everybody sort of panics. And the fact is, on the data that we can see, that the deaths are, in Ontario, more people have died over the age of 90 than under the age of 80 combined, right? And in Alberta, we're seeing that the vast majority are elderly and have not one or two, but 3 or more serious underlying health conditions. So it is not quite the risk that it's being portrayed to be, I don't think, for most people, for most of us who are under 60 or 70 years of age. It's very little risk, actually.
Yeah, I mean, none of this makes any sense to me because, as you said, and, this is in all of the news reports, this isn't like secret information, but, air travel is responsible for 2% of all COVID cases. So it doesn't make any sense to me that people who travel into Canada with negative tests should have to they shouldn't have to do this 14-day quarantine thing at all. Never mind, being detained in some quarantine hotel at their own expense. And And so it does seem to me that this is like about public pressure. Like, I think that the public just, they want someone to blame. Like, there's a problem, they have no control over it, everyone's mad and stressed out, and it's like, whose fault is it? It's those people's fault who went to Florida. Like, and so Trudeau is just kind of flailing and panicking and inventing nonsensical responses so that it seems as though he's doing something.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we saw, even going back to the very start of this quickly took on a moral panic almost, and you could not reasonably question the, like the skeptics who have, and I consider myself one of them, who have from the beginning said, well, wait a minute, shouldn't we be balancing things here a little bit? We now know that this is primarily concerning people who are elderly. Age is the most significant risk factor for an unfortunate outcome. So why don't we devote our resources to protecting those who are most vulnerable and let everyone else carry on? Well, that quickly became sacrilege to say something like that. You're going to have blood on your hands for questioning. So there's very much a morality that has developed around this, and the shaming that goes on for people who don't, who talk about civil liberties. Why is it evil to talk about civil liberties? But it's become that way. And interestingly, it's sort of overlaid, as you probably noticed. It's almost kind of overlaid on top of the culture wars, right? And a lot of the people who have a certain moral superiority in that forum, it's translated over now to COVID. These very same people very often are the ones who are pushing for, we've got to shut everything down. We've got to save grandma. But they conveniently ignore the real harms that are occurring to children, to teenagers who are committing suicide. The number of babies and small children who are being turning up in Children's Hospital in Ottawa. There was just an article about this, has doubled over last year because of head trauma and that kind of thing. Like, their parents are stressed, people are frustrated, and kids are suffering. So, but we can just all ignore all of that and forget about having a conversation about balance and are we doing the right thing? And could there be a better way to do it? We're not allowed to have that conversation. So that when that has happened, when you're going to vilify people, even doctors who take a contrary opinion or report them to their college, I mean, we're seeing that happening too, for having an opinion that goes against the grain, you're in a moral panic. And that rationality has gone out the window. And the government is responding to the moral panic and not to the facts. So it's just a bizarre situation to find ourselves in, and to be having this 10-month period, which has no end in sight. I mean, there's no end game to this, right? Because there's going to be new variants coming for the next several years, right? How long do we persist with this? And for some people, they're talking quite comfortably and happily about this lasting until 2022. So.
Yeah, it is. It's really strange how politicized the response has become and how polarized that politicized response has become, because as soon as I started talking about, speaking sort of critically or questioningly about the lockdown measures, what was working, what wasn't working, what was harmful, I was attacked in the same way. Well, I was attacked as being right wing essentially. And, I mean, I feel like I repeat myself all the time. I'm like, I'm not right wing, but I don't even like having those arguments. Like, I don't want to have to engage in those kinds of labels. I want to talk about ideas and facts and so on and so forth. But it's strange to me, like you say, it's sort of the same group of kind of cancel culture people, I don't know, I mean, you call them social justice warriors, whatnot, people who are very attached to a certain kind of ideology, who are demanding the lockdowns and vilifying anybody who questions any of these measures and not engaging in good faith. I find that a lot of people don't engage with what I'm trying to say in good faith. So It's like you don't care about people's well-being, like you don't have any morals, you're just being selfish, you're just mad because you want to go party, like, and we're talking about all sorts of things. We're talking about health impacts, we're talking about unemployment, we're talking about people losing their businesses, we're talking about the economy, we're talking about mental health, these long-term impacts. And of course, we're talking about civil liberties. We're talking about violations of the charter. For example, and I know you guys are responding to this as well, this issue as well, wherein I think that there have been some people in Canada who have been fined for is it religious gatherings? I'm not sure exactly what the term is, and protest as well.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's true. There have been just tons of these kinds of cases where they're trying to escalate enforcement, right? So while they let people kind of get away with certain protests in the summer, the late spring and early summer, which were politically acceptable protests, by the way, and that was during gatherings restrictions too. Those the Black Lives Matter protests back in June were when you could only have a gathering of 5 outdoors. But that didn't matter. That was okay. But when you have a lockdown challenge or protest, then, you've got to have the police in there. So, here in London, we had 10,000 people out for Black Lives Matter. And by the way, I'm perfectly happy that they had a chance to protest. Protesting is protected under the Charter and for good reason. But I don't like the double standard. Hypocrisy is what bugs me. So it's okay for the 10,000 to meet, but 200 lockdown protesters meet in the same park. And, there are tickets for the organizers, there's summons to court. So we are defending a bunch of people who have been charged for peaceful protests and now they're escalating against the churches. So we've got a whole bunch of those all across the country, actually, because some of the churches are they're drawing their line in the sand and saying, look, we have a freedom of religion in this country. We shouldn't be going underground. That's what you do in Iran. You can't send church groups underground and treat them like they're non-essential, that they should have no rights. Anyways, some of the churches are certainly abiding by the rules very faithfully, and that's a source of frustration for those who do want to be able to meet, because they're treated as though they're somehow, irresponsible, even within their own communities. So there's moral judgment all around. But at the end of the day, because the Charter does protect religious freedom, that is actually the kind of case that we are more likely going to be advancing and are advancing across the country, because there is explicit protection for religious freedom and for peaceful assembly. So we have a number of charter challenges started. Hopefully we'll get into court. It takes a while, but it'll be a couple of months for some of them. Small businesses we have a lot of sympathy for, but they don't have explicit charter protection, so we can't help them quite the same way. So yeah, it's been the civil liberties piece is interesting because I think there's already been a lot of again, because it maps so well onto the culture war. It's a continuation of a trend to dismiss those individual liberties as we move more towards groupthink and authoritarianism, which doesn't really permit any individual liberties. It disdains them. And so that was already happening. Those pressures were already happening. You see with people being canceled for their wrongthink and their speech. We were busy already before COVID, but this has just escalated the attack on those civil liberties. And the more we as a society become comfortable with and actually desirous of a more authoritarian kind of government, the harder it is to protect those freedoms. So I think we're going to be battling hard on a lot of fronts for a lot of years to come. This is really setting that sort of liberal democracy idea back dramatically.
Why is this happening in Canada? So in the US, Americans are still allowed to travel freely. In as much as they're allowed to cross, Americans aren't allowed to cross the border into Canada, I don't think, but Americans are allowed to travel back and forth. They're not being punished in the US, right? So they do have to get tests now. This is what I understand. And I know that it varies a bit state to state, but I have seen no threats of, detaining Americans. Like, they're allowed to come and back. I'm in Mexico right now. And so I've talked to a lot of Americans here. There's a lot of people here from California. There's people here from Colorado. There's people here from other places. And they can go back and forth. And they have a bigger problem with COVID than we do in Canada by far. Mm-hmm. So why is Canada doing this?
Well, I think that there is a significantly different culture between the two countries. In terms of freedom. And I mean, the polarization is greater in the US, I think, too, but we're tracking onto that too. But I think, we define ourselves as being kind of not American, right? And so when the Americans are these freedom-loving cowboys, if that's how they're perceived sometimes, we're kind of, compliant and prepared to put the common good ahead of our individual interests, because that makes us kind of different. We're politer. We're not into that messy freedom stuff like those crazy Americans. So I think that's a bit of a cultural difference that allows our country to just kind of walk into that a little bit more blindly than the Americans do. I mean, they've got license plates. New Hampshire says "live free or die." I mean, they're committed in a lot of places. Although they obviously have the conflict that we do too. It's just, it's a bit more ingrained in their culture than it is here.
Is Canada currently in a state of emergency? Or is that like a province to province thing?
Yeah, it's provincial. So the government federally never did invoke the Emergencies Act, which usually is only invoked if it can't be, actually it hasn't been invoked because it's the successor to the War Measures Act. The War Measures Act was last used in 1970 in the October crisis. And, one of the things that, when we step a little bit into the future after a calamity like the the October crisis or world wars or whatever, we can look back objectively a little bit and say, okay, well, what did we do wrong in that circumstance? And we did that after the War Measures Act was implemented in 1970. A lot of people who had been detained, I don't know if your audience would know the circumstances of that, but so I'll just briefly elaborate. But in October of 1970, there was a problem with a group called the Front de Libération de Québec, the FLQ. They were kind of a radical liberation group in Quebec that wanted socialism and was to achieve their ends. They kidnapped a couple of diplomats. One was a diplomat, one was a member of parliament in Quebec. They killed the latter, Pierre Laporte, I believe his name was, if I recall correctly. So Pierre Trudeau at the time was trying to basically ensure that other diplomats weren't going to be likewise plucked off the streets and arrested, kidnapped. And so he implemented the War Measures Act, and a lot of people were detained. They ended up, most people weren't ultimately charged with anything or convicted of anything, and they ended up having to pay compensation to a lot of people who'd been rounded up. And there was an interesting exchange. It's worth looking at. Looking it up on YouTube, there was an interesting exchange with a reporter on the steps of Parliament Hill so this reporter asked Pierre Trudeau, why would you want to put police all over the streets? I mean, is that the kind of Canada that we want to live in? Where he said I would rather live. The reporter said, I would rather live in a Canada where we don't have police everywhere, where we don't have War Measures Act, where we don't, and if it means that some of you people get kidnapped, then so be it. He wasn't prepared to trade a free Canada for a police state. And it was just a really interesting exchange. And Trudeau ended up implementing it. And in the aftermath and looking back, we realize that it gives an awful lot of power to the cabinet when we're in a state of emergency. It lasted only for a number of months. And for most Canadians, they could come and go as they please. It wasn't even as restrictive for most people as what we're dealing with right now. But like all emergencies, they end up concentrating power in the cabinet rather than in the legislature. And that allows the government to act quickly, but it also can be very dangerous for civil liberties. And so we haven't had occasion to use it since then. So most of us in living memory have not seen our government concentrate power the way that they've done. And even though there isn't a federal state of emergency right now, you know, they curtailed the legislature to a great degree. They weren't meeting as much. And provincially, there are states of emergency declared in several provinces. So in Ontario, where I am, Doug Ford had declared a state of emergency back in March. They could extend it by 14 days, and then they had to go back. So it was a total of 28 days. And then they had to go back to the legislature and get approval to extend it again. And they kept extending it every 28 days until I think July. Then they passed new legislation called the Reopening Ontario Act, where they basically transferred over, they ended the state of emergency, but they transferred over all these emergency orders into this new act. So it was kind of a backdoor way of keeping the emergency going while not actually having an official state of emergency. And that could continue, all those orders could continue for a year before you go back to the legislature. Now he's declared another state of emergency as of January 8th or 12th or something, and that's expected to go till February 11th. The legislature then has to approve that for any extension. But essentially, we've been living under a state of emergency for all intents and purposes for 10 months, because even during the period where it wasn't officially in place, he was still enforcing gatherings limits and other restrictions. And it's, you know, the longer these things go on, the harder it is. You have to remember that people kind of get used to living without these freedoms, and we start to then be grateful for a crumb or two that they give us, right? Instead of demanding back our full-throated freedoms that we had before, we're going to be satisfied with, okay, now you can go out in groups of 10. Oh, yay, lucky us. And so that's what happens is when these things go on too long, is the culture changes, and suddenly now we're not free people anymore. It's not a free country.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at first it's like, oh, you have to quarantine for 14 days if you go traveling? Like, that's ridiculous. And now it's like, oh, I wish I could just quarantine for 14 days after I go traveling in my apartment. Like, God, if only I could just stay trapped in my apartment for 2 weeks instead of staying trapped in a hotel for thousands of dollars. I mean, like, it's insane. I wonder, do you know if there's been any other challenges like the one or the ones, I suppose, that that the Justice Center has mounted in response to these restrictions to the government? You know, like, I know that in New Zealand, I think for some months now, they've been doing this mandatory government quote, like, hotel quarantine thing for people who leave the country. So essentially nobody can, like, everyone in New Zealand is trapped in New Zealand. Mm-hmm. I wonder if anyone has tried to challenge that. I mean, how has New Zealand gotten away with this for so long?
Well, I don't know. And when you talk to New Zealanders, a lot of them are happy about it because they have now been able to get on with their lives to the extent that, you know, like they're having concerts and they're going out and about. But as soon as something comes back into the country, and it will, I mean, you can't stay closed forever, then what are they going to do? Are they going to shut everybody down again? And actually, just I think even yesterday or today, Australia, one of the I think around Perth, they just implemented yet another hard lockdown because one case came in. I mean, so are we just going to be on tenterhooks constantly for years to be shut down? Like, it's impossible in a country like ours anyway. We're not an island. We have this massive land border, which we need to have goods go across. It's not possible for us to try and achieve some sort of eradication of a virus. And certainly at this point, it's going to become an endemic. We have to learn to live with it, is what a lot of experts are saying. But no, I don't know that it's been challenged in New Zealand. I haven't heard. It may have been. I'm not as aware of that. There have been a few cases recently in the in Europe, including Germany and Brussels, where they have had some that they've been favorable to the lockdown skeptics. One in Germany where somebody was challenging a charge that they had received, and the judge basically said that the lockdowns were a gross overreach or something. I haven't looked at the decision itself. I just saw an article about it. It's in German. I have to translate it. In Brussels, also Belgium, there was a case against masking, mandatory masking that was recent. So, I mean, there are starting to be some decisions. It takes a while to get into court. For our own cases, well, we've had a number that we've started, and we've pushed the government back behind a line on certain things. For example, we got in Ontario, we got the drive-in services that were previously banned. We got those permitted explicitly in the legislation. They revised the order after we sued. We got the houses of worship open to 30%, in large part because we threatened to sue. We got passports being issued again. We got essential caregivers back into long-term care in Ontario after we sued, not explicitly because of our efforts, but the timing was such that you kind of think it must have been. They haven't really wanted to get into court to justify their measures, it seems. So when you do push them, they do seem to back off a little bit. So we'll see, because we've got three charter challenges launched out west, and likely going to be one here in Ontario in response to a church that's been found in contempt of court. I'm going to challenge that order that basically bars them from meeting. So that may get us into court. We'll see what happens. I mean, so far there have been a few injunctions, which are interim emergency order applications that there was one in Alberta, one in Manitoba, one in Ontario, and they were all churches trying to get open. And the courts gave the benefit of the balance of convenience to the government, but the burden of proof was on the church because they were injunction applications and they weren't hearing all the evidence on in full with experts and all that. That the fullness of the evidence wasn't before the court. So we haven't had occasion to get all of that in front of a court yet. And then the burden is on the government to justify that its restrictions are proportional, minimal impairment, all the things that are part of the test under Section 1 of the Charter, which is what limits our rights. I don't know if your listeners and viewers would know that, but we do have these guaranteed fundamental rights, but they are subject to reasonable limits under Section 1 of the Charter. And that's really what the question comes down to. Are these limits reasonable, and can the government justify them?
So tell me specifically, you're suing the government over these new travel restrictions. Can you tell me about the specific charter violation? Like, what aspect of the charter is being violated in terms of these specific travel restrictions that Trudeau's just imposed?
Mm-hmm. Well, so one of our lawyers is working on pleadings right now. I haven't seen what she's pulling together. And we also haven't seen the order that is going to be imposing these things. So that may change the analysis. But on the face of it, Section 6 of the Charter is our mobility rights. We have freedom to come and go into the country and out. And so when the government is arbitrarily detaining travelers and putting them into forced quarantine in a hotel, that is, in our view, a violation of Section 6. Because if you have a positive test in this country for some other reason, say you go, say you're an essential caregiver and you go and get your weekly test that you have to have done to go into long-term care, and you're found positive, they don't put you in a hotel. They don't take you out of your home and confine you. They just say, well, you have to stay off work for 14 days, or you can't come into the long-term care home for 14 days until you're clear. But if you travel, which you have the right to do, somehow you're in this special category of people who are being selected for harsher measures. You now cannot just go home and quarantine. You're now forced to go into the government's place of confinement for you. So there's an arbitrariness of treatment as between the different classes of Canadians, which is unconstitutional. People are being detained without access to a lawyer, without any sort of order. These are healthy people too, in many cases, right? So the Quarantine Act, I mean, it serves its purpose. You don't want people with Ebola coming in and wandering all over the country and infecting everybody. But when you've got people who are healthy, asymptomatic, a lot of studies are starting to come out that suggest that asymptomatic transmission is quite rare. It's not as significant as we initially feared. So if you have no symptoms and if you've got a negative test, why are you being held? Right? Like on what basis can they decide that you're some particular threat to the rest of the country? I don't know that they can meet their own tests for detention if you are asymptomatic, healthy, and particularly if you have a negative test or if you've already had COVID. And that's the other thing too, is that unless they have exemptions for this that we have not yet seen, doesn't appear to be any sort of exception for somebody who's already had it and may have immunity or who's been vaccinated, or, it's just everybody. You travel and you're punished by going into confinement. So.
Yeah, it's really strange. I mean, do you suspect that this challenge will have an impact? I mean, I know that you can't predict the future. You can't necessarily predict the response, but do you think, you've said that, your other challenges have had an impact. Do you think that this challenge will impact Trudeau's decision and these restrictions?
Well, I hope so. Like I said, we had success with, one other thing federally was the passports. And we sent a demand letter saying, look, we do have these mobility rights, and you've got bureaucrats who are refusing to reissue people's passports. They are allowed to leave the country. There's no restriction on leaving the country. And they have to have a meaningful ability to do so by being given the travel documentation that enables that. But because everybody was off work, they just basically shut down all the Service Canada outlets and weren't issuing any for months, unless you could establish that you had an urgent situation. So then you had some bureaucrat arbitrarily, again, just sitting there deciding whether your particular circumstances for leaving the country were sufficiently urgent. So again, that's not constitutional to have somebody deciding whether the law applies to you or not and whether your circumstances are sufficiently urgent. The government doesn't need to know why you want to leave the country. It's none of their business. It shouldn't be their business. But anyway, once we sent a demand and then sued, they did start issuing passports by mail. So typically they back off, but only a little bit. Not as much as you want them to, but enough to ruin your case.
Right. And I mean, do you suspect that, should these restrictions stick? Should Trudeau maintain this hotel quarantine thing? He says that it'll just go till April 30th. Do you suspect that's true? Like that April 30th?
I don't know.
He'll end the restrictions.
I hadn't seen how long they were going to do that. I saw the April 30th as being the deadline for not being able to leave the country. I don't know if they've put in a deadline for this new testing requirement or not. And I also don't understand why they're not implementing the antigen test or the rapid tests, which I had thought was going to be something that they were going to bring in. So now we've got people having to wait for 3 days for PCR tests, which, are not perfect tests either. I mean, maybe the antigen tests aren't perfect, but the PCR tests aren't. They often generate false positives too. So,
right. I mean, I did, because I've been reading the reports, and because a lot of people who are abroad right now have just decided to stay. People who plan to be out of the country until the end of March are going to stay until the end of April, because on the basis that Trudeau had said. I mean, that's what it sounded like to me in any case, that he would end this as of April 30th. But I mean, Who
Yeah,
knows?
well, hopefully we'll know this week a little bit more detail. They've promised that it's coming in a few days, and then maybe we'll know a bit better what they're planning. And once we see that too, then our lawsuit will take shape more. So, I mean, again, we're sort of guessing, but just given how many times the goalposts have changed, you can't assume anything. And this is one of the things that is causing people stress and mental health issues and so on too. You've got to have some way of knowing that there's an end in sight to this, right? So the more that it's almost like we're in some sort of psyop or something. Like how much can we push people and stress them out and give them a carrot and then take it away? And it's really quite the thing. There should be an end game, and the problem is that none of these governments have set an end game for any of this. And as long as there's going to be new virus strains cropping up, and there will be, because that's what viruses do, they evolve. There are going to be millions of different strains. There have already been different strains that we like. If you look at sort of the map of how it has evolved, some of them are more concerning, and we don't know what they entail. But my goodness, are we going to do this every single time there's a virus or a flu, or when we don't know how virulent it's going to be? Are we going to shut down our border every time? And the data does not appear to show that like the cases are starting to drop off, actually, in the UK and other places where this new the altered virus is coming from. So I don't know whether there's really sufficient evidence to show that it's more deadly. There's speculation, but we've seen lots of modeling all along that's been quite wrong. So anyway, I don't know, Megan. It's been a very frustrating year. You can, if you saw me a year ago, I didn't have the bags under my eyes. It's just been a very, very, very long 10 months trying to push back, trying to keep the government in line, trying to answer everybody's concerns and inquiries. There aren't that many lawyers, by the way, who seem to be concerned about this. So it feels like we're it, or maybe the CCF and maybe a few other lawyers, but not many. So people are reaching out to us constantly and stressed and worried. And when this announcement came out, we got a deluge of people saying, "Oh, well, we had a trip planned," or "Our son is coming back from school," or all these hardship stories constantly that we're hearing about from people. It's a very stressful time. And our officials and our government have just been absolutely laser focused on one thing, to the complete exclusion of what I think are going to end up being far more devastating consequences than COVID. It's quite a time to be alive.
I totally agree. I mean, it's been incredibly stressful, isolating, depressing. And like you say, I mean, it's the not knowing. Like, I think that people can manage if it's like they know, oh, well, I just had to do this for a month, or even I just have to do this for 2 months or whatever. But, at this point, it's like they keep changing the goalposts, and they keep extending. They say, oh, just until, November, whatever, just until January, whatever. And then they extend it, or it gets worse, or they take away a curfew and reimpose a curfew, like there's curfews in Ontario and Quebec. And it's just kind of torturous. And I feel really frustrated, not just with the fact that it's happening, but the fact that people are not really taking that seriously, like are sort of, there's a lot of kind of mockery, like, oh, like, no big deal. Like, people have been through worse. It's not like you're in jail. And it's like, this is kind of like a lot crazy making. Give something, take it away. I do see it as kind of a form of torture. I know that's kind of an extreme word to use, and I don't like hyperbole, but it's a really messed up way to treat people. These are people's lives, and people can only take so much.
Exactly. I mean, the suicides and the devastation in families, divorces, being cooped up in a small place. It makes me crazy that so many of these people calling for these measures, haven't had an interruption in their paychecks and are being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to sit at home and have Zoom calls and feel important and have their advice listened to. And suddenly they've got a huge Twitter following because, they're public health people or epidemiologists, and the average person who has to go out anyways and go and work at the grocery store or the gas station or whatever, they don't get the benefit of all of that, but they get all the hardship. Or you're trying to run a small business, or my heart breaks for restaurants and gyms and all these places that have been trying to make it go and are just this is hard on people. And even if you're getting a little bit of a CERB check or whatever they call them now, we're not meant to be sitting on our behinds and not doing things. We're meant to have a purpose. And I just think the devastation that we're going to experience from this will be potentially generational. This is not something that you can't flip a switch on a complex society, as they all thought they could do back in the spring, and just have no consequences to that, and flick it back on and flick it back off. It doesn't work like that. We're like this tightly wound gyroscope spinning on a wire. Everything is just so precise and complex and delicate. You just change things a little bit and it all falls apart. And we've changed things a lot. I think we're going to be picking up the pieces for a long time to come. The other thing that concerns me probably the most as a lawyer is that there are all our constitutional norms and boundaries seem to just be thrown out. Like everybody's just making stuff up at this point. It is what it sort of feels like. Norms like getting people whisked off in unmarked cars to undisclosed locations. That is not the kind of thing that we would normally accept in Canada. Having people not able to go and see their relatives. Another norm, what the provincial government in Ontario has done, which is just, the normal liberal free society rule of thumb is you can do whatever you want unless it's expressly prohibited. You're free to do it because it's a free country. But no, we now have that all turned on its head. You can't do anything unless it's expressly allowed. I mean, that's just an incredible shift in what should be an untouchable norm. But all the norms are gone. And until we can get into court, and I don't even know what's going to happen when we get into court, to be perfectly honest with you, I just don't know. Like I said, the courts so far have not really dealt with the merits, but they have weighed in on these injunctions and on other little things, and they seem to be wanting to give the governments a great deal of deference. The courts themselves mostly closed down for like 6 months or something. I was shocked by that. There were some exceptions that were automatically treated as urgent matters that could be brought, but none of them were constitutional challenges. That was not expressly included as one of the important things that you could bring to the courts. So any constitutional challenges that we tried to bring, we had to get permission. We had to prove to the court, first of all, that it was urgent. And that, again, is a norm that, we normally don't have. You don't have to get permission. You just sue. So it's just been, and frankly, so many of the scholars and lawyers that opine on all of this say, well, Section 1 allows all this leeway. And so it's almost like that's the only section of the charter that they see. So I don't know what to make of it all, and we'll be digging out for quite a long time and do what we can.
So what would you say to Canadians who are abroad and who are worried about what's going to happen to them once they try to cross the border? What should they do if something messed up goes down?
Well, I mean, you have to be prepared. We can't get it into court fast enough. If you're thinking of coming back and, let's put it this way. First of all, don't leave if you're planning on going on a holiday and you're going to be coming back in the next couple of weeks. I wouldn't bother. Cancel your trip if you can, because you're going to have to deal with all of this, and you may get stranded. You may have to spend that couple of weeks in a hotel if you come back with a positive test, and it'll be at your expense. So for anybody who's worried about that kind of an expense on the return, you maybe shouldn't take the risk and go in the first place. And for those who are already away, well, I mean, you just need to be forewarned as to what to expect. Hopefully you get the right test, and hopefully the test comes back negative and you can carry on your way. But I would like to be able to say that we'll have this sorted out in court. But, even if we bring an injunction, I'm sure it'll still be at least several weeks before we can get an early decision. And most of the injunctions have not gone our way. So.
And how can people support your work and what you all are doing at the Justice Center?
Well, get on our mailing list and find out what we're doing at the jccf.ca. And, we have been doing a lot. I don't know that most Canadians know what we've been up to, but I think we have been actually, despite my rather depressing commentary tonight, I think we have been successful in keeping our government in check to some degree, more so than the opposition has, quite frankly. In most jurisdictions, we've managed to get, for example, in Alberta, the Kenney government to back off on Bill 10, which was imposing or giving themselves a great deal of power in single ministers. We threatened and then sued, and they backed off a bit. So we've been quite effective. And if you want us to continue to be effective, then please do support us with donations. It's a donations-based organization. All of our lawyers are paid through the generosity of Canadians who want to support what we do. We have hired a couple more lawyers, and we are hiring one more, I believe, in the next little while. So the donations have been coming, and that's great. We need them, and we do appreciate every single one.
Alrighty, well, I can't thank you enough for all the work that you're doing. I just can only imagine how exhausted you are. This is a very stressful time for everyone. Pretty dark times, but I mean, at least there's people who are pushing back and people who are paying attention, and hopefully people are going to be holding the government accountable.
We'll do what we can, Megan.
Thanks so much for talking with me.
Okay.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.